Hey guys, welcome back. I am super excited about what we're going to be talking about today because today we break into composition. Up to this point in the course, we have talked about some pretty cool things. We've talked about ISO and how you can use ISO to control the graininess of your photograph. We talked about aperture and how you can use your aperture to control the depth of field, that range of focus, whether it's a very narrow focus or a very wide focus. And we've talked a little bit about shutter speed and how you can use shutter speed to control the amount of motion blur you get or whether or not you freeze action in your photograph. And those are all really cool things. But composition is where we take creativity to the next level in photography. And I think you'll find that as we go through this lesson in composition, that you've got some pretty powerful tools available to you to create some pretty stunning images. So with that, let's go ahead and jump over into the slides and talk a little bit about composition. All right, so when it comes to composition, the first thing that I want to talk a little bit about is focusing your vision. And focusing your vision, it's really about figuring out what it is you're really photographing and then including only those parts of the scene that are actually relevant to the story that you're trying to tell. So, for example, when we look at this picture, do you find your eye kind of roaming aimlessly through the shot? Kind of wondering, what am I trying to focus on here? I mean, is it the snow? Is it the sky? Is it the trees? Is it the building that says Student Center? I mean, what is it? There's so much clutter and so much confusion in this image. It's really hard to tell, what am I trying to look at? And that clutter, that busyness, makes it a very uninteresting photograph. So what do? Well, I move in a little bit closer. Well, obviously at this point, the snowfield and the sky, they really weren't that important. That really wasn't what I was looking at. But I'm still kind of wondering, why are the words Student Center cut off here? Maybe what's drawing me in here is the color of the brick or that contrast of the word Student Center against the brick. I don't know. I'm still trying to figure out what in the world was it that originally sucked me in to want to photograph this particular building. So I stand there for a minute staring at the building, trying to say, what in the world? There was something interesting over here, but what was it? And then suddenly, in that moment, I see it. It wasn't the building overall. It wasn't the landscape with the building. It wasn't that pale white sky. What it really was those repetitive patterns and symmetrical shapes in the detail of the building. It was the interaction, I guess you could say, of the lines and the contrast. And maybe it was the organic shape of the tree against that symmetry of the building. So the problem here, if we step back a little bit, is that too often we just settle. We snap the very first picture that crosses our path without even knowing why in the world did we decide to take that picture, or what exactly was it that motivated us to use up a frame of film or a few bytes of data on our card to get this photograph. And you know what? It's this approach in photography, and really in anything for that matter, that utterly kills passion, it kills excitement, it kills motivation. If we'll just spend a few minutes looking around, exploring a little bit, and asking ourselves questions to try to figure out what it was that caught our attention in the first place, then we're going to walk away with significantly more powerful images. And here's the kicker. It doesn't really have to be amazing to everyone. It really just has to be amazing to you. That is what matters. And the more you do that, the more finely tuned your vision will become until, it becomes difficult to stop seeing all of the unbelievable opportunities that are around you all the time. There's one other thing that I need to drive home when it comes to focusing your vision, and that is that as you're out there focusing your vision, realize that there is never just one right answer. So, for example, here in this shot, maybe instead of focusing on, the organics of the tree against the symmetry of the brick, maybe the thing that really drew me in was the drain on the step. And if I take a minute and I slow down and I look and I ask myself questions and I explore different opportunities, different angles, different views, then maybe I start to ask myself, well, what if I position the drain in the lower right or the upper right? Is one better than the other? Well, maybe, but that really depends on what you were going for. And maybe the whole building thing wasn't really that interesting to me. So I decided to focus on the flow of people, how they travel in and out of the building. And there we go. Another right answer to the question of what it is that's really drawing me in. There are a lot of right answers out there, but there's never just one right answer. So as you're going out there focusing your vision, start looking, start thinking, and stop trying to just get things done. And you know what? That right there is the first step to creative composition, focusing your vision. So now let's talk a little bit about one of the most common rules of composition that you'll probably hear out there. And it's probably the most common rule you hear in just about any book out there that talks about photography or composition. And that is the rule of thirds. This whole rule of thirds thing, basically it states that if you divide your frame into thirds both ways, and then you place your primary subject along the intersection of those lines, or on one of those lines instead of in the middle, which most photographers, when they're starting off, they tend to do that. They put everything right in the freaking dead center of the photograph. If you do that, then according to the rule of thirds, you'll have a much nicer looking picture. And this is a good starting point for improving your photography, but really it's not a cure-all for bad pictures. And one other thing too that you should know about the rule of thirds is that being geometrically accurate does not make your pictures better. So you'll notice, for example, in these two pictures, that the true center of interest is the eye of the subjects. And those eyes are not exactly on the intersect or touching one of the third lines. Yet, they're still pretty good pictures. So basically, in a nutshell, the most important concept behind the rule of thirds is to stop centering your subject. Move them up, move them down, move them left, right, or, somewhere else, unless you have a really good reason for putting the subject right in the center. I'm going to show you here a couple of other examples using the rule of thirds, and basically to move a horizon line away from the center and into the third. Again, you can see here that the horizon is not exactly on the third line, but it isn't in the center. And this helps to kind of draw you into the picture a lot better than if it were placed in the center. Another principle of composition that I want to talk about is simplicity. A simple image is basically, it's an image that's devoid of clutter. So let's take a look at this picture here, for example. We've got this picture of a volcano. The picture that you see on the left, though it may seem simple in the fact that it's a picture of one thing, the reality is that this picture really is not just about the volcano. It's about the big blue sky, and it's the volcano and the tree in the foreground, and then also, the pink and white dots in the sky from the lens flare. But you can see there's a lot of competing elements here in this photograph. You compare that to the picture on the right, and you'll notice that with all that extra clutter removed, your eye can a lot more easily focus on what really is the most important thing here in this photograph, and that is the dramatic nature of the volcano. So the principle of simplicity really, it's very closely related to that principle of focusing your vision. It's getting rid of all that clutter in the photograph and focusing in on that one thing that matters. Let's take a look at another example here. So with the image of the peacock on the left, really when I look at this, I don't know whether to look at the feathers, whether I should look at the bird or the sidewalk or the fence or the snow or what. But by isolating everything but those feathers, I create a very simple yet very powerful image. And then finally here, this last image I want to show you, the peacock that you see on the left gets totally lost in the clutter of those branches. By just shifting my position a little bit and then moving in a little bit closer, I'm able to very easily eliminate all those distractions that are really drawing your attention away from the bird and focus your attention in on the features of the bird. So now let's jump back to that crappy image of the peacock and talk a little bit about balance. The different shapes and colors and then the light and dark areas of your image, they create what we call visual weight. If an image that you take ends up being a little bit too heavy or too light in certain areas, then it ends up being unbalanced. And generally speaking, this is kind of awkward to the person who's looking at your photograph. So, for example, here in this shot, the heavy dark shapes of the sidewalk make the image kind of feel like it's heavy on the left side and leaning to the left side. Now, for those of you who are super excited by the rule of thirds, because you could get your ruler out and you could measure whether it's on the third or not, I'm going to have to disappoint you here when it comes to balance, because balance is one of those principles of composition that cannot be measured with a ruler. The only way to measure balance is by using your gut. Does it feel balanced or does it feel off balance? And that's something that's going to take some time. You're going to have to look at the photograph and say, hey, this feels a little bit awkward. I wonder if it's off balance. And then you look at the photograph and try to make those decisions. All right, now there are two types of balance that you need to be aware of: symmetrical and asymmetrical balance. Symmetrical balance is basically where you could cut the frame in half and pretty much have the exact same image, sort of like the image that you see here in the middle. Asymmetrical balance, on the other hand, uses elements that are, they're about the same visual weight, and they're used to offset each other, to offset a part of the image that's heavy. So with the image on the left, the couple in the left of the frame could cause the image to sort of feel like it's falling to the left. Including the window, however, kind of helps to counteract that, resulting in an image that's more visually balanced, that basically feels right. With the image on the right, the dark circles kind of help to balance the dark floor, and then the couple that's on the left. So you can see the difference between symmetrical and asymmetrical balance. Here's a couple more examples of a balance. The image that you see on the left and the image that are in the middle are symmetrically balanced. So I could basically slice them right down the middle and have the same image, only it's a reversed image. With the image on the right, the bright area that you see could be a visual eyesore. However, it's counteracted with that large dark shape of the door, which then helps to draw your attention back and balances out the shot. One thing that you really need to avoid when it comes to balance, or really just about anything for that matter in photography, is making sure that you are either right on or you're purposely way off. If you're just a little bit off, then you create this sense of sort of this awkwardness in the viewer. So let me show you some examples. Here we have a nice shot of my sister and her husband, yet something seems a little bit awkward, at least to me it does. The problem here is that they're just a little teeny bit off center, but not so far that they're in the left third or even further over. So if I move them over to the exact center of the image, I create a much more balanced image that doesn't have that nagging sense of, something just not being quite right. Here's another example of slightly off balance. So balance really, it doesn't just apply to light and dark shapes. It applies to focus, and it applies to just about any other part of photography. So looking at this shot of the bird, what's the first thing that you went to? My guess is that you probably went to the eye, but then it was so painful to look at it because it's out of focus that you go to the beak. But then you're drawn in and you want to go back to the eye, but yet it's so uncomfortable when you get there, you go back to the beak. So you're having this conflicting experience as you're looking in this photograph, because where you want to go is out of focus, and where is in focus is not necessarily where you want to go. And so it creates this sense of something being off, something being not quite right and out of balance. Once I get the eye in focus, however, bam! much more balanced because where your eye wants to go is in focus and you're not distracted by the fact that where you want to go, something is not right. All right, and one last example. So here we see that the horizon line is tilted just a little bit. And that makes us feel kind of like the whole scene is falling off to the right and we're in it and we're going to fall off the photograph to the right. If it were tilted even more, well then that could probably work because it would seem like it was intentional and it would probably add a lot of energy to the shot. Once I correct the horizon though and remove that distraction, I have a significantly more powerful image. Pretty amazing how removing just those little things that can cause an image to be off balance have such dramatic results. So as you're out there shooting, and then later when you're looking at your photos, remember to be hot or to be cold and not warm. If you're neither here nor there, you're floating somewhere just right off the perimeter of the center, you're going to drive your viewers away. So you need to commit yourself and you need to move forward. Let me show you some examples of what happens when you really push those limits. So here we have blatantly out of focus, way off center, and a horizon line that's way off level, but at the same time, they work, and they work really well. So as you're out there shooting and you're playing with this principle of balance, the challenge that I give you is to push the limits of balance, but be intentional about it. Don't get back home, pull up the shots on your computer, and find out that you were just slightly off. You were neither here nor there. You were just kind of warmish, and you've created a whole bunch of awkward photos. Either try to get that balance right on, or make it wildly off and see what you can come up with. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about contrast. Traditionally speaking, contrast is it's the difference between lights and darks. If your lights in your photograph are light gray, and your darks in your photograph are dark gray, sort of like in the image that you see here on the left, then you have a fairly low contrast image. If on the other hand your lights are white and your darks are black and you have a bunch of gray tones in between, then you probably have a high contrast image, kind of like the image that you see on the right here. Some other ways that you could play with light and dark contrast are, for example, by having a light subject against a dark background or a dark subject against a light background. Basically, the darker your darks and the lighter your lights, the greater the contrast. But contrast isn't just limited to light and dark. And this is where it gets fun. Contrast means comparing one thing to its opposite. So, for example, old, young. Slow, fast. This contrast here has an almost dizzying effect on the viewer if you stare at the young man. And, it sort of creates this sense of stillness among busyness. The stillness seems stiller and the busyness seems busier because we've contrasted them with one another. Here we have an example of big-small contrast. Try and imagine this image right here without the contrasting element. I mean, what would this photograph look like if you took, the big guy out or the little guy out? It would just be a guy in a suit. Or the picture of the dog. You take the little dog out or the big dog out, and it's just a picture of a dog. But when you put them side by side, the small looks smaller and the big looks bigger. And that's the power of contrast. Here's another one. Rough, smooth. Looking at this shot makes you almost cringe with discomfort, seeing that really rough rope against the smooth, soft, delicate skin of the model. All right, let's take a look now at another principle of composition. Yes, there are more. Can you believe it? The next principle of composition is repetition. Repetition can both soothe in its monotony, or it can really drive an idea home by kind of stating it over and 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 over again. One of the powerful things about repetition is that it can become somewhat mesmerizing, which makes it easier for the viewer to stay engaged in the photograph. So as you're out there, look around for repetitive patterns, and then maybe you could even use, the principle of simplicity to draw it in and create a really great shot. So here in this shot, for example, I've isolated that repeating pattern of the sailboat masts, which kind of gives the viewers, something to visually engage in for a minute. And then when they get tired of that, they can either jump up to the smokestack or maybe move over to the mountain and then jump back down and go through that repetitive pattern of the sailboat masts. In this image here, the repetitive pattern, for me, it carries an almost soothing and mesmerizing feel to it. And from my perspective, that's going to help draw the viewer in and keep them engaged. I mentioned a minute ago that you could use that principle of repetition to drive an idea home. Think about that for a minute. How would you do that? Think for a minute just about a subject that's within your grasp that might be emphasized by showing lots of them repeating. And then think about what message that might convey versus if you just had like one or two. So for example, think of a soldier by himself versus hundreds of soldiers. Or think of a single baby bird reaching up to eat a worm from its mother versus having 5 of them in a row reaching up. Or, think of something like 2 boys roughhousing versus 30 boys duking it out for candy that fell out of a piñata. Hopefully that makes sense. The idea that you can repeat something to drive the message home, and you can repeat something to give it more energy and more emphasis. Another tool of composition that I want to talk about is leading lines. No matter what you take a picture of, there will always be lines in your image that are going to lead the eye of the viewer somewhere. The challenge is making sure that those lines lead the viewer to where you want them to go and that lead them into the image instead of drawing them out and away from the image, off the picture and on to the next thing on their to-do list. So let's talk a little bit about that. In this picture, for example, you'll notice how the lines on the blanket of the baby lead your eye gently back and forth up towards the face of the baby. And then as you get tired of looking at the face, now I don't know who would ever get tired of looking at that cute little face, but your eye then is led down through the blanket and then back up to the face of the baby. In the shot of the landscape with the puddle of water, that S curve, it leads you towards the horizon, and then once you hit the horizon, it draws you back down to the puddle, back and forth, keeping you engaged and visually sort of trapped in the image. You'll notice it also in this shot that the arc shape of the cloud, it also kind of serves as a barrier to keep you centered in the image and keeps you from wandering, following that line down and that curved line and then being jutted right out of the image. For those of you who can't see these lines here, let me sketch them out here for you so you can see what I'm talking about. This is sort of maybe how your eye might flow as you look at this image and engage in this image. Now, the things with the lines here in this shot is that these lines are somewhat literal, meaning that if you look at the shot, you can kind of see the line. There are other kinds of lines as well that I'm going to call implied lines. Implied lines are when the lines that are most dominant aren't the literal lines in the picture, but they're the lines that are created by the movement of the eye, where your eye naturally wants to go. So in these pictures, for example, there are lines in the rock and, from the shadow and in the clothes and appendages of the people. There are lines all over the place. But the real dominant lines are formed when we move from the eyes of the people to the basket in the foreground and then back to the people. Or in the case of the image that's on the right, from the bride to the flowers to the eyes of the groom and then back and forth and back and forth. The important thing here is that you're aware of how your eyes are moving through the image. If you ever find yourself or someone who's looking at your pictures getting bored really quickly with your image, then there's a good chance you might have a problem with lines leading them off the image or a bunch of lines that just lead to nowhere of interest. Here's a quick example of what can happen when you aren't paying attention to lines. The scene's pretty nice, but the lines of the path end up leading you right off the image. Recomposing this shot by, moving the frame slightly to the left, that probably would have given you a lot more space on the left side so that the path, instead of taking you right off the frame, would lead you right into the scene and it would keep you engaged for a lot longer. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about mergers. Mergers are awesome because they can make photographs ridiculously horrible or they can make them insanely silly. And I'll show you what I mean in just a minute. Mergers are basically when some part of the picture ends up overlapping another part of the picture in a really awkward or uncomfortable way. So, for example, on the left here, we have a couple of tourists, one of whom seems to have purchased a Capitol hat in the gift store. This is a fairly common mistake that photographers, especially beginning photographers, make simply because we get so focused on the subject that we're photographing that we forget to notice what's going on in the background and everywhere else in the photograph. We get a lot of clutter and not a simple image, and we miss things like mergers going on. The second type of merger that you can see here in the middle is a near merger. This is when you have basically two unrelated objects nearly touching each other. Just looking at this shot, can you feel that tension with the umbrella being just an inch away from like jabbing her in the face? I sure can, and this is extremely awkward for me. So watch out for how you place your subject in relation to other objects in the frame. Give them enough breathing space so they don't feel awkward or they don't overlap in a way that just doesn't work. Sort of goes back to that idea of neither here nor there, hot or cold, not warm. If you have just a sliver of space, it just doesn't work in most situations. Final type of merger is an edge merger. That's where your subject interacts with the edge of the frame in a really awkward way. So, for example, slicing off the top of people's heads like you see right here. Or, it could be chopping off somebody's arm or something in a really awkward way. Another thing that this could mean is creating near mergers with the edge of the frame. So that could also be awkward. Even though you're not cutting them off, they're just so close to the edge of the frame it feels really awkward. Now, I said a second ago that mergers can destroy an image, or they can also create something that's ridiculously funny. This next series of shots that I'm going to show you, as far as I know, they were done completely unintentionally, but they can show you the creative possibilities that could exist out there if you put a little bit of thought into it. Check them out. So now let's talk about color. I once had a teacher, and this teacher told me that a color photograph is about color. In other words, if you're shooting color, then color, whether you like it or not, it's a major component of your picture. So you really need to be aware of what colors make up your image and the impact that they have. Now, the reality is that most of us are more interested in the subject than color, which that generally ends up producing images similar to the image that you see here on the left. This image has a mishmash of just about every color you can think of in the spectrum. There's nothing dramatic, there's nothing subtle, there's nothing soothing, and nothing really even that interesting about the color. It just happens to be in color. Once you start to limit that and focus in your vision on the color, simplify the color scheme, you start to create significantly more effective images in evoking that emotional response in the viewer. Kind of like what you see here on the right. Blue and yellow, warm and cool. And let's talk about some of these color schemes that you might keep an eye out for as you're out there trying to figure out what's the best color scheme to use. So the first and the most simple color scheme to look for is a monochromatic color scheme. Monochromatic basically means one color. Remember that rule of simplicity? Well, that rule also applies to color. The more simple you get in your colors, the more powerful your images become. Colors can be cluttered and busy, just like subjects in your photograph. So the more clutter and the more busyness you remove from your photograph, the more focused it becomes, generally speaking, and the more powerful it can become. So here in this slide, we have an example of both a cool blue monochromatic image and a warm yellow orangey monochromatic image. And one thing that I do need to say about blue and yellow, images that generally have a lot of blue or a blue overtone are generally referred to as cool, simply because most of us associate blue with colder temperatures. Things like ice, cold water, etc. So what does that mean to you? Well, it basically means that if you want your audience to feel cold, to feel isolated, to feel cool, then use a blue color scheme. On the other hand, color schemes that have a lot of orange or red are generally referred to as warm or hot. And that's, again, because most of us associate these colors with heat. So, for example, a flame or a hot unit on the stove, an interrogation room, things like that are considered warm, or, they feel hot. Now let's pull two colors together. If you place a warm and cool color next to each other, or colors that are opposite to each other on the color wheel, then you end up with what are called complementary color schemes. These color schemes are, they're generally bold, they're really dramatic, and really they feel powerful depending on how vibrant the colors are. So you'll notice, for example, with these images that there's a lot of intensity. You can imagine, for example, what these images would have looked like if, for example, the wall on the left was totally white, or the sky with the hoodoos there was just, overcast and totally white. It would have lost something. It would have lost some of the intensity and some of the powerfulness that comes by contrasting two opposing colors together. Another color scheme that you can look for are analogous colors. These are colors that are next to each other on the color wheel. So things like yellow and green, or red and yellow, red and purple, or purple and green. These color schemes or color arrangements are a little bit more subdued than complementary colors, but they can be equally as powerful when it comes to creating very engaging and simple imagery. The final group of colors that I'll mention, and the reality is that there are a lot of color combinations out there that work really well, but for the scope of this presentation, and just not to overcomplicate things, I'm going to keep it to just these few. So the final grouping of colors are primary and secondary colors. On the traditional color wheel of colors, the primary colors are red, yellow, and blue. And the secondary colors, which are opposite the primary colors on the color wheel, are green, purple, and orange. There's also a color wheel of light, and those colors are red, green, and blue as the primaries, and the secondary colors, the opposites on the color wheel for those, are cyan, magenta, and yellow. These combination of colors can create very strong and very intense impressions on the viewer, just, depending on the vibrancy of those colors. The more vibrant they are, the more intense they're going to be. The more subdued or desaturated, the less intense they're going to be. Now, I want to pause for a minute here and talk a little bit more about vibrancy. What exactly does vibrancy mean? Vibrance basically refers to the saturation of a color. A black and white image is completely unsaturated in color, meaning it basically has no color. It's black and it's white. A super saturated or super vibrant image is one where the colors are really intense because each pixel is peaked on the amount of color it can contain. No black, no white mixed in, just color. Generally speaking, you never really want to go fully saturated because it just looks really weird and unnatural. However, saturation and vibrance do play a very powerful role in that final image that you create. The more saturated you go, the more powerful, dramatic, strong, and intense the look and feel of your image. The more desaturated you go, the more subdued, calm, quiet your image is going to look and it's going to feel. So remember, when it comes to color, color definitely matters. So before you snap that image, ask yourself, what colors am I looking at here? What am I including in my shot, and how do they make me feel? If you look at it and you say, the colors don't really match my subject, see if you can go find a different color scheme that does. This might mean changing the location. Maybe you change your subject's clothing. Maybe you change the time of day that you're shooting or under different weather conditions or light conditions. The key here is that no matter what the problem you run into, there is always a solution. Let me say that one more time. No matter what the problem you run into, there is always a photographic solution. And you know what? Really, that goes for both photography and it goes for life. Sometimes that solution might be to change something, and other times the solution might be just to not worry about it, stop wasting your time, and to move on in a different direction. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about framing. You can actually rotate your camera sideways. You know, I say that because most of the time when I teach these basic photography classes, a lot of people, when they shoot that first assignment, lift their camera, point, and shoot. And that's it. What they usually find, however, as they go through the class is that actually rotating the camera 90 degrees, maybe 50% of the time, will actually give them a better shot, a significantly better shot than if they just lifted, pointed, and shot in that default horizontal frame. So this sort of takes us back to that principle of focusing your vision. Take time to stop, to think, to look, to ask yourself questions, and explore different angles and compositions. Hold your camera horizontally and vertically and see which one will give you the better shot. You may want to ask yourself some questions as you're out there shooting, like, if I hold my camera horizontally, am I including a lot of clutter? Does my subject fit better if I rotate it 90 degrees or if I keep it in the default horizontal? It might be that both horizontal and vertical work equally as well, but you're never going to know until you explore. So as you're out there, remember that as you're framing your subject, you can rotate the camera 90 degrees. Another thing that you can do that's kind of fun to do with framing is to compose a frame within a frame. This is a particularly strong way to present to your audience an alternative viewpoint that they may not have explored otherwise. And that sort of brings us to our next principle or tool of composition, and that is point of view. With regards to point of view, the thing you have to keep in mind is that a photographic frame is a look at the world through some person's point of view. For most people, that point of view is from the perspective of the average person looking at the average scene from the average point of view that we're all familiar with. Once you step out of that prison, however, and start exploring the same places from a new perspective, you might find that your images start to take on a whole new dimension. Think about that. I mean, what would a bird looking in the second story window see at an event? Or what would a beetle making its way, out of the bottom of a pit see? Or what does the world look like through the eyes of an adult looking down on a child? Or the eyes of a child playing with another child? Or what about a bird that's passing by as a couple are married on the rim of the Grand Canyon? Or maybe a child who's watching their parent get married? What would they see? And another component to point of view is it's not just changing your position, but it's looking around to see things that most of us never even notice. In order to do that, though, we go back to that focus your vision. You got to slow down and you've got to look. In these shots here, for example, most people, they were probably so focused on the ceremony that they really never even noticed how minuscule the couple was against the Grand Canyon backdrop. Or they may not have even noticed the details in the way that the bride was holding the card and the layout of the text. They also most likely failed to see those quick, fleeting expressions of the bride and, the footwear or the lack of footwear worn by the stars of the show. So point of view, that concept of point of view is really about opening your eyes to what's going on around you. It's about exploring aspects of the world that you have never seen because you've been too busy seeing the world just like everybody else. All right, now let's talk a little bit about depth. Depth has to do with how far the viewer can visually travel into the scene. So images that have a lot of depth have stuff that's really close in the foreground, and then they have stuff that's really, really far away in the background. It basically looks like you could just jump into the photo and then you could go walking for miles. Images with little depth, or flat images as they're called, don't really leave much space to explore in. Now, neither of these is right or wrong, but each one of them is going to give the viewer a completely different emotional experience, a completely different visual experience. So think about it for a minute. How would you describe the experience of looking at a picture with a lot of depth and a flat picture? Now, the reason why I want you to reflect on that is because if you can describe the emotional experience that you have when you're looking at a photograph, you can then analyze the tools that are used to create that experience. And then when you go out and say, you know, I want to create this image and I want to have this, I want to build this experience in the viewer as they look at my photographs, well, you know exactly what tools you can use to make that happen. All right, we got 2 principles left to cover. Let's talk about positive-negative space. In the tradition art field, there is a concept known as negative space. Negative space is basically that empty space surrounding the object. And that space, when you look at it, can be just as interesting as the object itself. So if we look at the classic illustration here of a goblet, for example, and then we shift our attention to the negative space, then we discover that there are 2 faces peering at one another, 2 very equal and very interesting images, a couple and a goblet. Equally interesting is this shot of the rocky horizon. With the shot on the right, if we shift our attention to the shape of the sky against the horizon instead of the rocky horizon itself, this image can take on a whole new visual experience. So consider negative space as you're out there shooting. And finally, the last thing that I want to talk about here is a common compositional problem that I think you should be aware of. And that compositional problem is called hotspots. Hotspots are basically where there's this dominantly bright area of your picture that you cannot escape. No matter what you do, it's almost impossible for your eye to ignore those really bright regions of the photograph. Now, that isn't necessarily always a bad thing. If the bright spot is, in fact, the most important part of the image, then that's great, because it's going to suck your eye into the most important part of the image. If, however, you end up with a picture like this, well, you got a problem. Notice how awkward this photo becomes. You want to look at the bison, but no matter what you do, you cannot help feel drawn to that super bright spot right there in the upper right-hand corner. And you know, after a minute, it probably becomes a little bit annoying because that bright spot really doesn't contribute anything to the picture. It just sucks you away. Remove the hot spot, and it's like taking a breath of fresh air. You know, one of the problems with hot spots is that sometimes they're hard to notice because we're so accustomed to looking at the subject and not necessarily the lightness and darkness of the different parts of our image that, you know, we just don't notice them. So the thing to do with hot spots, and really with just about any principle of composition for that matter, is when you look at a photograph and it feels awkward, it feels like there's something not quite right, start cycling through these principles of composition. Is it awkward because it's off balance? Is something off balance? Is it too busy? Is there a hot spot? Do the colors just not work right? Is the principle of repetition not used very well? Ask yourself those questions. And in doing that, you'll be able to reverse engineer your photograph, figure out what it is that's causing it to be awkward, and correct it, and walk away with insanely powerful images. All right. I hope I've got the wheels churning now with the principles of composition. You've got an amazing tool set to play with, and we're going to take a minute now. We're going to review through the assignment, and I want you to go out and have a lot of fun with this assignment because you're going to get to be, you know, really creative in this assignment. So let's walk over to the assignment and see what we've got coming down the pipe for you. All right, so as I've said, The arrangement of objects or subjects in your photograph can, of course, dramatically impact whether your viewer is drawn into the image and stays in your image, or whether the image ends up boring and distracting the viewer so that they quickly lose interest and walk away and go on to the next item in their to-do list. In this assignment, we are going to explore the different principles of composition and how they impact your final image. With this assignment, I am going to be pushing your creativity and problem-solving skills a little bit by setting some limitations with this assignment. I want you to do the best you can, and I want you to see what you can come up with. So what you're going to master in this assignment is, of course, the visual principles and elements of photographic composition and how to apply them photographically. All right, so here is the assignment checklist. Number 1, I want you to isolate yourself to one object or subject for 10 exposures. And what I want you to do is to explore a different principle of composition with each exposure. Now, you're welcome to do more if you'd like. You can shoot 20 if you want, but I want you to take that one object and I want you to try to explore that whole range of composition principles. All right, the next item is to isolate yourself to a place or a location. And again, 10 exposures, more if you want to, but the bottom line is in that place, in that location, I want you to again explore all of those principles of composition that we've talked about today. When you're done, I, of course, want you to reflect, and I want you to write down how did applying the different principles of composition to the same object or subject alter the look and feel of that object or subject. And then ask yourself, were there certain principles that worked better than other principles? And then I want you to do the exact same thing for that part of the assignment where you limit yourself to a location. And then ask yourself again, did anything work? Did certain principles work better than others? And why do you think that is? And that is really critical for this assignment. Don't just look at it and say, ooh, yeah, I really like repetition. Why do you like it? And why does it work well with that subject? Or why does it work well with that place? Ask yourself those questions and dig deep until you find an answer. Now, again, with this assignment, a big critical part of this assignment is that I want you to slow down. I want you to look. I want you to ask yourself questions. I want you to play around. Don't just go point, snap, shoot, done. Go look, explore, stop, think, look, explore, move, stop, think, and then shoot. That's part of the process of this assignment and working with composition. You need to slow down and you need to look. It's sort of like, I don't know if you've ever played a musical instrument before, but to get really good at a musical instrument and not make mistakes, you have to teach yourself, you have to play the instrument without making mistakes. If that means you start off playing the guitar and you're doing a note and then another note and then another note, making sure that each time your finger is in the exact spot and your hand that has the pick is plucking the exact string, you do that perfectly, even if it goes really, really slow. And then as you do that over and over, you become faster and faster and smoother, and you do it without making mistakes. You have to do the same thing with these principles of composition. Take it slow, look, listen, think, listen to yourself, think. And as you do that, and as time goes on, you'll learn to see these principles of composition. As you're going about as a photographer, you'll look at a scene and say, I know what I need to do. I know which principle. You don't even have to say which principle. You'll just frame it, shoot it, and it will look great. So that's the challenge. Now there is, again, a exposure log here in the assignment. You're going to write down the description of the subject, the aperture, shutter speed, and the principle of composition that you're exploring so you can track it, because sometimes you look at your photograph and you're like, was that simplicity or was that balance? I can't remember exactly. Write it down. All right, that's composition. Hopefully you've got some really great ideas spinning around in there right now, and I look forward to seeing what kind of images you walk away with. Let's see how see whether or not this assignment will take your photos to the next level.